Welcome to the College Rivals Podcast, where it's all about heated rivalries within track and field and weekly innovative discussions on how we revolutionize the sport of track and field into a professional league on par with the NBA and the NFL. And now, your host whose favorite thing in life is to disrupt society for the good, Simon Bowen. Welcome to College Rivals, where rivalries begin and never ends.
Hello, team of rivals, sporting fans, track and field boys and girls. This is Simon Bowen, alongside my co-hosts Tosha Woodward-Sumner and Michael Jasper. Welcome to another episode of College Rivals Podcast, where I'm honored to interview distinguished guests, track and field athletes, experts in media, the business of sports, branding and marketing, coaching, sports management, sports psychology, sports medicine, mental health, and other interesting people, talking about rivalries and how we revolutionize the sport of track and field into a professional league on par with F1 motorsport, the NBA and NFL. Now, track and field in comparison to other sports require immense precision, as it is solely measured in meters and seconds, and even sometimes at thousandths of a second. Because of that, the advanced technology that records data from track and field races must be as precise and accurate as possible. The technology involved in track and field ranges from personal gear to equipment for track events to the technology in track itself. Prior to 2012 London Summer Olympics, a number of technological advancements were unveiled to improve the sport. Some of these include the electronic starting blocks, and an electronic starter pistol, another innovation employed to improve the start of track events. The use of radio frequency identification, famously known as RFID chips, which is to monitor a runner's speed, distance, and patterns. This now has become mainstream, in which any athlete can purchase these. There's also the use of global positioning services. There's also Feelings, a software application that deals with the scoring and administration of track and field events. Runners are not only track athletes benefiting from new technology, field event athletes' performances are being affected by new measuring techniques such as the use of the laser line system as well. We also see the rapid technological advancement in running gear, watches like the Vistaband, and running shoes, the controversial Vaporfly shoes, etc. The sport of track and field is looking for a sea change in terms of transforming the sport into a viable professional league, a new model that in sync with today's modern society and the digital age. Hence the urgency for a platform for sports technology to gain traction and recognition to solve some of these problems the sport faces now and in the future. That's why my guest today is Frank Diana, a futurist, thought leader, and frequent speaker. He has served in various C-level roles throughout his career and has over 35 years of leadership experience. Currently at TCS, he's focused on future shaped by changes in the societal, geopolitical, and economic landscape and the associated implications for business. He blends a futurist perspective with a pragmatic, actionable approach, strong ability to connect the dots and identify future scenarios quickly and broadly. Now today, we're talking about how innovation in sports continues to accelerate at an alarming rate. How will technology impact the sports industry, that is athletics, running? How can sports and technology coexist? Will technology take away the sport or make it more accessible for fans? With our special guest from Tata Consulting Services, TCS, a well-respected managing partner, Futurist, certainly will have a lot more to say on this topic and more. For our listeners and viewers, this episode should be a bit geeky, nerdy, and deep into the future of what our sport might look like and how we can maximize the use of current, trending, and upcoming technologies to help us to break the ground in the transformation of our sports. Frank, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. Quite the introduction there.
Thank you. So for our viewers, I met Frank. Well, Frank has been doing a lot of interesting work, and it has caught my attention online. The first article I read was a running tech survey that he did some presentation on, I think it was around in 2020, perhaps colliding with COVID. And it was fascinating to see how athletes and society and runners, what's really happening. And so I actually started to follow Frank on Twitter. And then I basically reached out to Frank and wanted Frank to come on the show because, and I guess, Frank, it's important for you to know. And I think people like yourself are really important in terms of what the future model of track and field athletics should be like. Just a quick synopsis of what's happening. So track and field is currently a semi-professional sport. It's very individualistic, although the way to go, looking at the trend with other professional sports, including golf, swimming, and tennis, we might perhaps would do better off moving to a team concept. But there are more issues surrounding the sport why we are currently stuck in a semi-professional tone. And it has to do with, not being able to stay abreast and intact and shift towards the technology more, even so to keep pace of technology. And I think it's really important to have you today because this might be the episode that triggers a lot of people who are in the position making these decisions. And we are here actually to add voice. We're here to focus on how we can impact change by running shows like these and bringing in important guests like you. So I'm really happy to have you on board, which leads me to now on one of the main reasons I happen to have a mutual interest in your work is an article I read that you presented on the future of athletics and society, a running tech survey, and it was critical for our sport. Can you shed some light on the future of sports technology? What might that look like in near reality for athletics/running, both on the track and marathon running?
So that article and that related survey, all part of TCS's focus on marathons. If you're not familiar with that, TCS sponsors the New York City Marathon, the London Marathon, and marathons around the world. So running was a core passion of our former CEO and continues to be a passion going forward. And the genesis of that future of sports, if you will, was related to our sponsorship. So with that as a backdrop, I focus, as you know, broadly. It's not just a running conversation, but really where is sports going in general and how does technology potentially reshape, as you say, science and technology, potentially reshape the sporting world. And I've done presentations on this that focused on everything from the fan to the athlete himself, to all the stakeholders that are involved in sports. And so we can go in a number of different directions with this conversation, from the underlying changes to the athlete that are likely to happen both through genetic engineering and or merging with machines and or other kinds of things like exoskeletons. There's all kinds of things that can be applied to the athlete between now and sometime in the foreseeable future that actually changes the broad sporting community in terms of the athlete participation itself. And that obviously opens up questions for society in terms of those paths. So I'll take your lead in terms of which angles you'd like to take here, because there's so many places to go.
Yeah. And it's funny how you broke down the skeletal. I remember seeing this graphic figure, how you pulled apart, and it's critical. The athlete, the fan, and the, what was the other one that you mentioned?
Well, the stakeholders.
And the stakeholders,
and the humans, the human as well. Yeah.
Let's start with the athlete first.
Okay, so we can talk about the athlete in terms of performance. And
yes.
If we look at performance in the context of AI as a coach, which is going to happen, if not already happening, where artificial intelligence lends much more to the performance of an athlete with running or other sports, AI will contribute to that. Virtual reality will play a role. And so there's so many different places where technology will help at the performance level. There's other things like enhancing the athlete, as I mentioned before, and that can be through genetic manipulation or engineering to make somebody stronger, faster, et cetera. The whole notion of we're already merging with machines and how far do we take that phenomena? And if we take it places where bionic limbs are part of an athlete's makeup, then I've talked about whether eventually you end up having leagues that are broken between natural athletes and enhanced athletes. And maybe you have a playoff between those two different leagues, if you will, to see how mere mortals do against those enhanced athletes.
Yeah.
So, all those things are possibilities as we think about the future where some of these technologies, and as I mentioned, sciences are going to take us. So performance is one, just really changing the whole nature of the athlete, if some of these things play out, is another. And then there's technology associated with even changes to sports themselves. So, for example, virtual sports, esports is already here, but do we take them to places where virtual sports start to really compete with the traditional sporting leagues that we know of today? There's things like using gaming and virtual sports to actually enhance our wellness, right? If we are more active today in the context of virtual sports or esports, that helps with the phenomenon of just sitting in front of a console and playing a game, right? So even maybe in terms of conditioning and helping prepare athletes in the future, those could be mechanisms that do that. So as I said, there's just so many things we could explore here in terms of.
Yeah.
Frank, I asked you a follow-up question about enhancing the athlete. How do you foresee that either equaling playing field or making it less equitable? Is it those that spend more get more enhancement, or do you think there's come a time where it'll be sort of routine and may actually make the playing field even more level?
Yeah. Well, first, the whole question of enhancing at the genetic level, there's a lot that has to happen to discuss the ethics doing that exactly, right? But if you move in those directions, then inequality, much like it is with any of these advancements, will get exacerbated. Where the people that have the wherewithal to do these things will do them. That you have at the individual level inequality, but then you've got the nation state level of inequality. What happens if nations that don't really consider genetic modification ethically being a problem? And think just in the context of the Olympics, what happens if certain nations start to do those things and their athletes, something like a gene doping, if you will, are much better prepared for an Olympic because they've been enhanced, right? So how does society deal with some of these things? And one of the key focuses that I've driven over the last several years is thinking about where these things may go, and then understanding the implications to society, and then walk back and start asking the questions: are these the right things for us to be doing going forward?
Yeah. Now, you spoke briefly about artificial intelligence, AI. Now, frequently, mainly with associated tech companies and other non-sporting industries, but not necessarily sporting teams. Now, I know a lot of change since. What can we expect in how this is used with sports equipment and wearables technology like smart shoes, etc., coaching and monitoring of athletes?
All of the above, right? Artificial intelligence, as it gains in terms of capability, in terms of acceptance, will permeate just about anything you can imagine that we do in a sport or sporting world. So all the things you mentioned, whether it's enhancing our performance, whether it's accelerated healing, which is another really big one that I think could actually help athletes stay on the field longer, extended careers, because not just AI, but some of the advances in health and medicine will actually help there as well. So there's so many applications across society, with sports being a great example of some of the things that we can do here. And again, it's performance, it's taking care of the human much more effectively, and even the viewing experience. So if we think about the fan and how we actually experience sports, you can see changes in the venue. So will be less and less the stadium and more a third venue, which in the past used to be the bar where we used to go have a drink and watch a game on TV. Tomorrow it becomes an experience center where we can actually go and watch a game and feel like we're actually in the stadium itself. To the athlete, that we can view the game through the lens of the athlete himself. So seeing what the athlete's seeing in real time, and the athlete or the fan calling plays. So think about football, and the coach on the sideline in real time crowdsources the next play to call, right? Making the fan an active participant in in the sport. I mean, all those things are possible given where we're going. A trade, a Major League Baseball franchise wants to make a trade. They ask the community whether it's a good idea, and the crowd gives them their thoughts, right? So
Yeah.
we're just thinking through not just the athlete, the sport itself, but the fans' experience and how that's changing.
Yeah, I think that's critical. You touch one of the things that I've discovered recently, and I think there's a few teams. I think Barcelona. So there is such a thing as smart stadiums, correct?
Yeah.
Now, could you elaborate a little bit about what that's all about?
Well, if you think about 5G and its rollout, it's becoming the enabling mechanism to broad, smart fill in the blank, right? So smart stadium is just another example of how we're using things like sensors and virtual reality and wearables and all kinds of things to not just make the stadium smart, but to enhance the experience, right? So if I'm watching a sporting event and I can see augmented around an athlete all of their statistics and vitals, performance metrics, et cetera, I can absorb all that while I'm watching the game, right? It's enhanced virtually or augmented through augmented reality, right? So a smart stadium starts to enable those kinds of experiences. And 5G is critical because the bandwidth required to do some of these things is obviously going to grow as more and more stadium features become smart. But those are just some examples of a smart stadium. But as I mentioned before, a venue becomes smarter as we can go to a venue and actually see a hologram replay of a play that happened on the field, right in the third venue, right? And so those augmented experiences happening in that venue as well. And if we think about this again from a societal lens, you might see sort of a stratification of how we experience sports, where some of the wealthy end up continuing to go to these more and more expensive stadiums, where the middle of society ends up in these third venues, but having just as good an experience. And then the rest of us in our homes experiencing sport. But ultimately, the smart home ends up facilitating an experience much like that third venue. It's really a progression, right, from the third venue ultimately to the home. And then the question becomes, if we can feel like we're right there at the stadium experiencing a track event, why do I have to go to the stadium? And then what's the ripple effect into society, right? Then you start connecting those dots. What happens if that plays out?
Yeah, yeah. And I guess one of the things that we do talk about here on Abash, so we are fans of F1 motorsport, and there is a strategic relationship with what's currently happening with F1 and what are we kind of, making that comparison analysis for track and field. Liberty Media, they are the powerhouse that took over F1 motorsport back in 2014 that have transformed the sport. And one of the big shifts that they realized that they had to do was digital marketing. Now, obviously F1 motorsport is expanding at an alarming rate globally. And so the timing of this conversation is critical. And it's one of the reasons why I brought you on the show, because one of the things with our sport at the moment, Frank, and why I think it's stuck in a semi-professional, and this is just one of the issues, the ability to actually move from a purist traditional sport, from back in time, switching to adaptation in the digital new arena. And so these topics that you have explored, I saw the relevancy of how it can apply to the sport of track and field. And in terms of smart stadium, I'm sure a lot of, like, every 4 years it's the Olympics and every 2 years is the World Championship. Is it crazy to think that, would you support something that these stadiums that keeps the Olympics and the World Championship, should we be moving more towards a smart stadium, or we should keep the stadium as is, but get more involved in the fan engagement side of stuff in terms of how they would interact with athletes, coaches while on the field?
I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, right? The smart stadium as an enabler of that engagement and interaction piece of what you just described, I think are kind of, that one enables the other, right? So it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. At the same time, There's so many other things we can do. This thing in terms of the Olympics. If you think about what just happened in the past Olympic, there was an awful lot of smart happening around that that last experience, right? So we're already starting to see some of that being embraced, and I would venture to guess in the next Olympics we're going to see a progression even from there. It's interesting. I show a video in my presentations. I show several videos, but one of them specifically is the robot. If you saw this at the last Olympics in Tokyo, the robot that was shooting baskets at halftime of that one game. Well, an interesting story. That robot, maybe 6-7 months ago, when I used to show a video of the robot, had to be handed the ball, moved into position, and then the algorithms took over, and the robot still made the shots. So 6 months later, at those Olympics, the robot's picking up the ball, moving into position, taking the shot. And I think that's just a really testament to the speed at which these things are happening. So I always tell an audience, so the next time I show the video, the robot's probably dribbling the basketball, and in some, foreseeable future, playing against other robots, a pickup basketball game, right? So if that world plays out, right, then back to that notion of two different leagues, is it entertainment to go watch robots performing in a given sport, right? And I don't know, they could very well be.
Yeah.
So we understand that this technology is here and it's here to stay. So are there any societal implications? Like, we see a lot of cheating scandals. You mentioned already the ethics regarding like gene doping and things like that. What other societal impacts do you foresee?
Well, with every one of these periods, and I do equate the period we're in to some of the historical periods of the past where big change has occurred on the back of innovation, whether it's science or technology. Every time that's happened, the world hits a crossroad where there are destructive things that occur and constructive things that occur. And it's usually society's challenge to manage that path. Now, we've done it effectively in the past. I maintain that we're not doing it real well today because it really does take a global community to manage these kinds of things. So if you think about in the context of sports, then the fairness question is a big question, right? The context of enabling those that can enable themselves to enhance their performance versus those that can't. There's that fairness question. How does that get resolved? There's the ethics question that you mentioned in terms of whether we should allow these kinds of things to actually happen and who's making those decisions. Ethics is a tough discussion because whose ethics are we really leveraging when we solve these challenges, right?
Yeah.
And so you have those questions to answer. And then, broadly, the whole mental and emotional health discussion that's ramped on the back of COVID, which is really important. And the role that technology plays in exacerbating those problems, right? If you just step back and think about the social media phenomena of the past and ask yourselves, how much has that contributed to isolation, bullying, the kinds of things that have really kind of accelerated some of the challenges, I believe, that we'll face as a society, both mentally and emotionally, right? So those are the other things I think about as this thing plays out. What are the impacts to that mental health side of this conversation?
Interesting.
Let me follow up with that a little bit on the technology side for the generations. So like generationally, Generation Z, generation, let's see, Alpha. Like we're in a time when we're embracing this new tech, like gaming and things like that, wearables. Everyone has a wearable, it almost seems. How can the sport of track and field use that to bring more people to grow our sport? Like I remember watching the New York Marathon. I want to say it was COVID year, or maybe right around when there was the virtual race and then the real race. And there was this cool board, and it was sponsored by TCS. And I think it was all sorts of neat data on the runners. And I'm like, oh, this is so great to follow. Like, we know how fast they're going. We know what their heart rate is. This person's stressed a little, but, then they go down a hill and things they're doing a little better. So it was really cool to see, like, how can that bring more people into, or technology bring more people, more fans?
Yeah, it's a great question and good examples you provided there, because that virtual experience during COVID, if you think about it, actually expanded the reach of the sport. Virtual during the pandemic has had its problems, but at the same time, reach has improved in terms of it's simple things like the running, right? And to the other point, everything these days is about experience, right? So the generations you referenced, it's all about experience to those generations. And so the more enhanced the experience, the more effective the outreach and the potential for engagement. And so you gave some great examples. I mean, those statistics that were provided as part of that experience just enhanced what they saw. Maybe generates interest because they're seeing something that they would never have seen if they were just watching somebody run. Right. And so it's a great question. And I think those types of things will enhance not just how we view these things, but how we might embrace them going forward.
Are some things on the horizon that you've seen are coming that can help
With engagement or
with you?
I'm not sure it'd be much more than what I've just referenced in terms of some of those kinds of experiences. But if you consider, for example, things like these third venues that eventually emerge and the kinds of experience that we'll have in those third venues, I think about, in the past, I'd go to a bar and watch a game. So if you go to a third venue and you just watch a track and field event, that experience will be really impactful and compelling when you think of the technologies that'll come to support the experience, like holograms and being right there on the track with the runner. Think about how you would experience that very differently than just watching it, statically on a screen. And so immersing the viewer into that experience is going to pay dividends, both in terms of how they experience it, but also their interest level in a sport, right? And I think metaverse, as I hate the buzzword, but if it plays out and you can actually replicate a track and field event in the metaverse and their experience then is dipped into that metaverse. I mean, there's a time coming, to answer your question a little more directly. When you can scan your body and you can actually be in that metaverse as opposed to your avatar.
Ouch. The future, scary. So talk to us about how tech is unlocking new revenue streams and reshaping the sports market industry. I mean, as an F1 motorsport fan, we have seen Liberty Media, as I mentioned earlier, capitalizing on such of a way of an obsession with data analytics and engagement for growing the fan base globally. Expand on this and know how my track and field adapt in a similar fashion.
So track and field and the athletes, let's focus on the athletes for a second. The engagement with fans in some of the other sports has gone direct, right? You've actually cut out the middleman, and the athlete, whether it's LeBron James or whoever, is actually going directly to the fan and communicating with the fan. The revenue opportunities that exist for the athlete are enhanced. NFTs are enhancing the revenue potential for the athlete, right? And a sport in general. So if we think about mechanisms like that, direct outreach to the fan, NFTs and what it possibly brings in the metaverse, all these digital kinds of avenues start to present themselves as far as monetization opportunity. And there's so many we can think about, but I mean, it starts there, right? It's how do we exploit phenomena that's already occurring, that athlete to fan direct connection in ways that we may not have done before. The fantasy example in baseball, football, and others is really a good example of how it started off as something small, and now it's a massive revenue generating ecosystem, if you will, right? So what kinds of similar things may come up in track and field that we can start thinking through and monetizing?
Is there also, so one of the things track and field kind of suffers from, not only is it the experience, but it's the making the fans more understand the sport easier. And I think that's one of the things with F1 has done a great thing with data, how they put things on the screen while you're watching.
Yeah.
And so if there was something that could be done in track and field to sort of, give people a greater appreciation of someone's running a mile and they're running 4-minute pace versus 3:55 pace, and kind of show that graphically on the screen with technology. I think educating the fans via technology is also very critical.
Yeah, and that's really an augmented experience where you start to show that kind of data around the performance itself as it's happening, and or as you just pointed out, um, some kind of educational content that is absorbed as they're watching the event. Small bites because you don't want to overwhelm anybody with having to absorb too much content at once. But those would be great enhanced experiences that do a couple things. Again, the experience becomes better, but to your point, you're educating at some level.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, how alarming are esports and alternative trend sports a potential threat to eat away sponsorship dollars from traditional sports?
Esports already surpasses things like the Super Bowl and the NBA championships as far as viewership, right? So it's not a hypothetical question, right?
Yeah.
Esports is a phenomena that I don't see slowing down.
Wow.
And so there's the esports piece of it, and it's already, like I said, become a massive phenomena. And the money, the money that is playing into that esports is also very impressive. The one area that I think really does add a lot of value is not so much the esports side, but the virtual sports side, because if in gaming that is whole body in nature, right? So you're participating in a game. But you're not just using a joystick or controlling the game that way. Your body is part of the experience, is part of the game. And so if we think about, well-being and health and obesity issues and all the things that we could talk about, right? If that evolves to a place where it's fun, it's engaging, it entices people to actually participate virtually in something like that, then I can see us solving another one of those challenges, and that is health-related challenges for future generations. So a number of these things, as always, have that destructive path potentially and the constructive path. And I'm just a big believer in managing the path towards that constructive end state.
That's so true, because one of the things that we've been blindsided by as a sport in general for track and field, very seldomly do we talk about associated health benefits and societal impacts that the sport, I believe, should command and demand and run with it, is even well-being. I did see part of your presentation during COVID based on the Run Tech survey. One of the things that we don't do very well, Frank, is make claim to this whole idea of running. You mainly see the shoe companies like Nike and Adidas put in lifestyle uniforms on pretty much everybody and being the leader, actually representing that realm of this whole health and well-being benefits. And I think one of the things that I am proposing for us to grow the sport, I think we need to be a little bit more, what you call it now, bold in stepping out and says, these are our people. We welcome people from the mountain running. We want people in our camp from a trail running, all the above, even recreational running. Your thoughts on that?
The linkage to well-being is an important linkage for a number of reasons. I keep going back to history because it really is very instructive. We had a period, 1870 to 1970, where the world's well-being, the standard of living was set. I think we've entered a period where these advances, both in terms of science and technology, are going to provide another opportunity to yet again enhance the world's well-being, this time globally, not Western world, the way it was back then, right? And so part of what I talk about is how do we manage as a society the invention and innovation that's occurring towards that end, right? And so well-being, meaning, our health and wellness, how we live, our means, our financial means, et cetera. So what role does running and the associated advances in technology that now support the sport play in that story, in advancing the world's well-being and connecting to it? Because it really will be a topic that I think is going to be discussed for years to come as we see more and more advances in health and medicine. I mean, when I tell an audience that I believe the first person to live to 100 is already on the planet, it's somewhat for effect, but it's also possible if we think about what's being done in the health and wellness space, right? So, I mean, all these things lead to a place where I think it enhances society if we do it right. And running plays a role. Just connect to it.
Yeah. If you could scare us a little bit by seeping in the future, there's a lot of people globally around the world more likely will hear your thoughtful words on some of these issues, but scare us a bit in the future, right? Track and field. So there's a struggle at the moment with us being a purist, and there's also issues around we are impure. Now, one of the things with advanced technology is, and I've seen F1 motorsport, I've done a bit of it with their cars, but they do have regulations and rules. How comfortable are you with the use of drugs? Is it possible that we could see down the future how society could be a little bit more comfortable with a little tweak in performance enhance? What potentially could be allowed? How the future might look? We're struggling at the moment, and it is a very good question to ask. Your thoughts?
I'm not sure I can predict exactly where the use of drugs goes. Much of this it will be speculative on my part, right? But having said that, linking back to invention and innovation, if we think about drug delivery mechanisms, right? So you said scare you. I mean, if nanobots are floating through our bloodstream and delivering drugs directly to where it needs to be delivered, if you're talking about that in the context of cancer, that's a very good thing, right? You're delivering it just to the cells that need to be impacted, nothing else. So we're going to see those kinds of things. We're already seeing advances in those areas, right? So in the future, drug delivery even becomes more targeted and precision oriented. And does that somehow enhance an athlete faster, more effectively? Who knows, right? But these things are all viable paths that we're seeing in the context of invention, innovation.
Mm. And what's your measure of in terms of the technology that's out there around fighting that category of impurities? There's a lot of major advanced technology that have come in place to detect drug cheating. You have any thoughts on that in terms of where we are? Are we catching up? Are we ahead of the game?
Well, again, not sure I can tell you from a broad perspective whether you're catching up or ahead of the game. But know that these kinds of exponential progressions that we're seeing in all of these areas will eventually lead to things that we're just not expecting. It's impossible to think through exactly where all these things lead, right? So a thought you may have that might sound outlandish is probably not. And the other part of that is a thought that you think is 15 years out is probably much closer than you think. And those are things that are important for us to consider when thinking about the future, because we can be very complacent if we think something is, decades away, when in effect it's closer than people realize.
What are your thoughts on Nike? Go ahead, Tosha.
Well, I was going to say, Frank, I know he needs to jump off, and sure. I want to make sure we ask him about the rivalry.
Oh yeah. So quick question, Frank. That Vaporfly shoe, what are your thoughts on that?
The Vaporfly shoe.
Yeah, Nike has a shoes out. So there's a lot of marathon runners that actually at the moment is using them. What are your thoughts on that?
I'm not familiar with it.
Yeah, it's some of us as athletes are very comfortable with. For me personally, I don't have an issue with a bit of tweaking in terms of how you help enhance traction, right? Between your foot, the shoes, and the surface. When it just came out, it was a bit controversial. And this is an example, right? To show you how, we're a bit of a purist as a sport, really traditional. And one of the struggles is we are trying to move the sport into a new era. And that's why I'm a little bit open-minded about tweaking a little, some of these things, but just have a bit of regulation rules around them. Can you share quickly some thoughts about us don't have to be scary because you've seen it in other sports as well?
Yeah, you definitely see some of these things happening in other sports. And so being more progressive in thinking is clearly something that the sports should consider. On the other hand, the inequality discussion that we had before is something to consider, right? If an athlete cannot afford some of these tweaks, then they are disadvantaged in the competitions of the future, right? So, progressive, yes, but I always think we have to think about the fairness equation and some of the conversations we had earlier about ethics, et cetera. So a balance. There's always a balance that's required here.
Yeah, I agree.
Big tweet
Agree.
there. Big tweet.
Yeah. Yeah. Which leads us to Frank. We usually ask our guests, so and it's any sport. What's the greatest rivalry that you have seen during your time?
The greatest sport rivalry. Two, the New York Mets and the New York Yankees here in my local New Jersey area. And and in my time here, the Dallas Cowboys and the New York Giants.
So are you a Cowboy fan or a Giants fan?
I grew up a Cowboy fan, believe it or not.
Oh, for sure. The Giants is gonna come after you, Frank.
Well, I've been hearing it for years, right? I live here in New Jersey, so
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Any closing, Mike, you wanna add to before Frank leave the studio?
Thanks so much for this. You know, in a nutshell, track and field needs to move more towards technology and meeting the consumer where they are, right? So as stated, we're this pure sport. We think the way it's been done is the way it's got to stay, and it's not. And we're seeing so things that you bring up about the use of technology, enhancements, engagement, education, all of those things, track and field really needs to embrace. A lot of differing thoughts, like, you know, shoes, that's a tweak, that can be a big tweak, but we have to do it. And so, you know, this podcast is attempting to bring this stuff to light. I think you did a great example because no other track and field podcast are talking about these topics.
Yeah.
Frankly, I don't think any of them want to go to that in that direction. So if your expertise is greatly, greatly appreciated. And
Agree.
a lot of people get a lot out of it and get a lot of conversation from.
Yeah.
well, happy to help. And what you described is a microcosm of a societal challenge, and that is status quo mentality, belief systems that have been ingrained in us because of our experience base, et cetera. It is a broad societal challenge because what lies ahead requires us to think differently. So it's not just the sport of running that has a challenge here.
Yeah.
Very well said.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me.
I want to, to our listeners around the world, I want to thank Frank for coming on the show. As I said at the top of the hour, as a thoughtful futurist leader, looking in the future and being sometimes bold and provocative, it's actually very useful. Being also disrupting and challenging the status quo. It forces us to think differently. And as what Mike said, which I will attribute to, is we as a sport of track and field, we have to start to think differently. It really needs a shakeup. And I think having your presence involved in this type of discussion, it's actually quite strategic. I hope our listeners around the world, including the powers to be, if you think about it, in a few years' time, LA 2028, it's right there in our backyard. And these are some of the things that I could potentially envision Los Angeles want to experiment with in terms of having some of these professional meets throughout the country leading up to 2028. So it's a work in progress. And we're really happy that you were able to share your thoughts. And of course, always inspiration. I will continue to follow you on Twitter and chime in on LinkedIn and wherever I can. We can talk again in the future.
Thank you all.
Thanks, Ray.
All right.
care.
Thanks. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the College Rivals podcast with Simon Bowen and his team of rivals. Please visit thecollegerivals.com for more information. And be sure to like and follow College Rivals Track and Field on Facebook. If you have any comments or would like to suggest topics for upcoming episodes, please email us at hello@thecollegerivals.com. Thanks again for listening. We'll see you soon.